Hey everybody, Mockingbird, chapter 17, the end of 16. We left off. They are in the courtroom. The kids are. They're not supposed to be there, remember? Atticus said, don't go downtown today. Also, my shirt. Won't have to. They are, but they're there. You've got all the white folks on the bottom floor with Atticus and Tom Robinson. And then the judge, also white. Tom Robinson's the only black person on that lower floor. Then you've got the balcony, and that's all the black folks with three little white faces right with them. Here we start. I believe Sheriff Tate is our first witness. Chapter 17. Jem, I said, are those the Yules sitting down yonder? Hush, said Jem. Mr. Heck Tate is testifying. Mr. Heck Tate had dressed for the occasion. He wore an ordinary business suit, which made him look somehow like every other man. Gone were his high boots, lumber jacket, and bullet-studded belt. From that moment he ceased to terrify me. He was sitting forward in the witness chair, his hands clasped between his knees, listening attentively to the circuit solicitor. The solicitor, that's the DA, like the other lawyer. Mr. Gilmer was not well known to us. He was from Abbotsville. We saw him only when court convened, and that rarely, for court was of no special interest to Jem and me. A balding, smooth-faced man, he could have been anywhere between 40 and 60. Although his back was to us, we knew he had a slight cast in one of his eyes, which he used to his advantage. He seemed to be looking at a person when he was actually doing nothing of the kind. Thus he was hell on juries and witnesses. The jury, thinking themselves under close scrutiny, paid attention. So did the witnesses, thinking likewise. In your words, Mr. Tate, Mr. Gilmer was saying. Well, said Mr. Tate, touching his glasses and speaking to his niece, I was called. Could you say it to the jury, Mr. Tate? Thank you. Who called you? Mr. Tate said, I was fetched by Mr. Bob Yule yonder one night. What night, sir? Said Mr. Gilmer. Mr. Tate said, it was the night of November 21st. I was just leaving my office to go home when Mr. Yule came in. Very excited he was, and he said to get out to his house quick. Some nigger had raped his girl. Did you go? Certainly. Got in the car and went out as fast as I could. And what did you find? I found her lying on the floor in the middle of the front room, one on the right as you go in. She was pretty well beat up, but I heaved her to her feet and she washed her face in a bucket in the corner and said she was all right. I asked her who hurt her, and she said it was Tom Robinson. Judge Taylor, who had been concentrating on his fingernails, looked up as if he were expecting an objection, but Atticus was quiet. I asked her if he beat her like that, and she said yes, he had. I asked her if he took advantage of her, and she said yes, he did. So I went down to Robinson's house and I brought him back. She identified him as the one, so I took him in. That was all there was to it. Thank you, Mr. Gilmer, Judge Taylor said. Any questions, Atticus? Yes, said my father. He was sitting behind his table. His chair was skewed to one side, his legs were crossed, and one arm was resting on the back of the chair. Did you call a doctor, Sheriff? Did anybody call a doctor? Asked Atticus. No, sir, said Mr. Tate. Didn't call a doctor? No, sir, repeated Mr. Tate. Why not? There was an edge to Atticus's voice. Well, I can tell you why I didn't. It wasn't necessary, Mr. Finch. She was mighty banged up. Something sure happened, it was obvious. But you didn't call a doctor but you didn't call a doctor? While you were there, did anyone send for one, fetch one, carry her to one? No, sir. Judge Taylor broke in. He answered the question 3 times, Atticus. He didn't call a doctor. Atticus said, I was just wanting to make sure, Judge. And the judge smiled. Jem's hand, which was resting on the balcony rail, tightened around it. He drew in his breath suddenly. Okay, pause. Pay attention to Jem during this trial. Scout will tell you everything that she sees, but she doesn't really understand a lot. Jem gets it. Jem is on the edge of his seat. He's paying attention. He gets everything. He knows when things are going well. He knows when they're not going well. And he won't tell you that, but you'll see it in his body language. So he said, his hand was resting on the balcony rail, tightened around it. He drew in his breath suddenly. This is important. Glancing below, I saw no corresponding reaction and wondered if Jem was trying to be dramatic. Scout doesn't get it. Dill was watching peacefully and so was Reverend Sykes beside him. What is it? I whispered, and got a terse shh from Jem. Sheriff, Atticus was saying, you say she was mighty banged up. In what way? Well, just describe her injuries, please, Heck. Well, she was beaten around the head. There was already bruises coming on her arms, and it happened about 30 minutes before. How do you know? Mr. Tate grinned. Sorry, that's what they said. Anyway, she was pretty bruised up when I got there, and she had a black eye coming. Which eye? Mr. Tate blinked as he ran his hand through his hair. Let's see, he said softly. Then he looked at Atticus as if he considered the question childish. Can't you remember? Atticus said. Mr. Tate pointed to an invisible person 5 inches in front of him and said, Her left. Wait a minute, Sheriff, said Atticus. Was it her left facing you, or her left looking the same way that you were? Mr. Tate said, Oh, yes, that'd make it her right. It was her right eye, Mr. Finch. I remember now. She was banged up on that side of her face. Mr. Tate blinked again, as if something had been made plain to him. Then he turned his head and looked around at Tom Robinson. As if by instinct, Tom raised his head. Something had been made plain to Atticus also, and it brought him to his feet. Sheriff, please repeat what you said. It was her right eye, I said. No. Atticus walked to the court reporter's desk and bent down to the furiously scribbling hand. It stopped, flipped back in the shorthand pad, and the court reporter said, Mr. Finch, I remember now she was banged up on that side of the face. Atticus looked up at Mr. Tate. Which side again, Heck? The right side, Mr. Finch. But she had more bruises. You want to hear about them? Atticus seemed to be bordering on another question, but he thought better of it and said, Yes. What were her other injuries? As Mr. Tate answered, Atticus turned and looked at Tom Robinson as if to say this was something they hadn't bargained for. Her arms were bruised, and she showed me her neck. There were definite finger marks on her gullet. That's a gullet on her neck. All around her throat? At the back of her neck? I'd say they were all around, Mr. Finch. You would? Yes, sir. She had a small throat. Anybody could have reached around it with. Just answer the question, yes or no, please, Sheriff. Atticus said dryly, and Mr. Tate fell silent. Atticus sat down and nodded to the circuit solicitor, to the lawyer, who shook his head at the judge, who nodded to Mr. Tate, who rose stiffly and stepped down from the witness stand. Below us, heads turned and feet scraped the floor, babies were shifted to shoulders, and a few children scampered out of the courtroom. The Negroes behind us whispered softly among themselves. Dill was asking Reverend Sykes what it was all about, but Reverend Sykes said he didn't know. So far, things were utterly dull. Nobody had thunder. There were no arguments between opposing counsel. There was no drama. A grave disappointment to all present, it seemed. Atticus was proceeding amiably, as if he were involved in a title dispute. With his infinite capacity for calming turbulent seas, Atticus could make a rape case seem as dry as a sermon. Gone was the terror in my mind of stale whiskey and barnyard smells, of sleepy, sullen-eyed men, of a husky voice calling in the night, Mr. Finch, they gone? Our nightmare had gone with the daylight. Everything would come out all right. She references that again. Not the mad dog scene, the mob scene. So she's like, I was expecting this to be bigger. That was a big deal. This is not very big. All the spectators were as relaxed as Judge Taylor, except Jem. His mouth was twisted into a purposeful half grin, and his eyes happy about. And he said something about corroborating evidence, which made me sure he was showing off. Robert E. Lee Ewell. In answer to the clerk's booming voice, a little bantam cock of a man rose and strutted to the stand, the back of his neck reddening at the sound of his name. When he turned around to take the oath, we saw that his face was as red as his neck. We also saw no resemblance to his namesake. A shock of wispy, new-washed hair stood up from his forehead. His nose was thin, pointed, and shiny. He had no chin to speak of. It seemed to be part of his crepey neck. So help me God, he crowed. So now, okay, we're going to get a little background. Remember how Scout kind of goes into the background? So you've got Bob Ewell on the stand to testify. This is Burris' dad. And now we're going to get some history about the Ewells, more that we don't know. Every town the size of Macomb had families like the Ewells. No economic fluctuation changed their status. People like the Ewells lived as guests of the county in prosperity as well as in the depths of a depression. No truant officers could keep their numerous offspring in school. No public health officer could free them from congenital defects, various worms, and the diseases indigenous to filthy surroundings. Macomb Jules lived behind the town garbage dump in what was once a Negro cabin. The cabin's plank walls were supplemented with sheets of corrugated iron, its roof shingled with tin cans hammered flat, so its only general shape suggested its original design. Square with 4 tiny rooms opening into a shotgun hall, the cabin rested uneasily upon 4 irregular lumps of limestone. Its windows were merely open spaces with which in the summertime were covered greasy strips of cheesecloth to keep out the varmints that feasted on Macomb's refuse. Um, so they live near the dump, behind the town garbage dump. Have you ever been to the dump in Vacaville? What do you notice about it? It smells horrid. It's awful to drive by it. The Ewells live there. Here's some more about them. The varmints had a lean time of it, for the Ewells gave the dump a thorough gleaning or pick through every day, and the fruits of their industry, those that were not eaten, made the plot of ground around the cabin look like the playhouse of an insane child. I always think of in Toy Story, the evil kid's backyard with all the broken toys in the backyard. That's what I think of when I think of the Ewells. What passed for a fence was bits of tree limbs and broomsticks and tool shafts, all tipped with rusty hammerheads, snaggletooth rakeheads, shovels, axes, and grubbing hoes, held on with pieces of barbed wire. Enclosed by this barricade was a dirty yard containing the remains of a Model T Ford on blocks, a discarded dentist chair, an ancient ice box, plus lesser items, old shoes, worn-out table radios, picture frames, and fruit jars, under which scrawny orange chickens pecked hopefully. One corner of the yard, though, bewildered Macomb. Against the fence in a line were 6 chip-enameled slop jars holding brilliant red geraniums, cared for as tenderly as if they belonged to Miss Maudie Atkinson, had Miss Maudie deigned to permit a geranium on her premise. People said they were Mayella Ewells. So the interesting thing about that is they live in filth and disgust, but they're these bright jars of brilliant red flowers. People said they were Mayellas. What does that tell you about Mayella? She tries. She tries to make the place pretty. She does more than the rest of them. She's different than the rest of them. Nobody was quite sure how many children were on the place. Some people said 6, others said 9. There were always several dirty-faced ones at the windows when anyone passed by. Nobody had occasion to pass by except at Christmas, when the churches delivered free baskets, and when the mayor of Macomb asked us to please help the garbage collector by dumping our own trees and trash. Atticus took us with him last Christmas when he complied with the mayor's request. A dirt road ran from the highway past the dump down to a small Negro settlement some 500 yards beyond the Ewells. It was necessary to either go back out to the highway or go the full length of the road and turn around. Most people turned around in the Negroes' front yards. In the frosty December dusk, their cabins looked neat and snug, with pale blue smoke rising from the chimneys and doorways, glowing amber from the fires inside. There were delicious smells about: chicken, bacon frying crisp as the twilight air. Jem and I detected squirrel cooking, but it took an old countryman like Atticus to identify possum and rabbit, aromas that vanished when we rode back past the Ewell residence. So notice the comparison. This is how the Ewells live. Look at the black folks. They have neat and snug with smoke rising from their chimneys, glowing fires inside, smells of chicken and bacon frying. Like, the black folks live better than the Ewells do. Significantly better, even though they're black folks. Yeah, I'm going to stop this chapter here, and then I'm going to come back and do chapter 2. So this was chapter 17, end of part 1.